I'm Tasneem Essop, and you're listening to Just Access, The Real Transition, a podcast from PARI, the Public Affairs Research Institute. This is episode 8. In our previous episode, we heard Dr. Ledger explain why co-production is the foundation of procedural justice, and why public participation so often fails when communities are invited in too late. But what happens when you try to build inclusion day to day inside a municipality? Researcher Kate Tissington works with local governments through Compact, a partnership between PARI, the South African Local Government Association, and Integrity Action, to turn co-production into routine practice. Her work asks, what does accountability look like when citizens and municipalities share the same table? Hi, Kate. To start, can you give us a bit of information about yourself, what you do with Compact, and what you're doing on this project in general?
Thanks, Tasneem. Yeah, my name is Kate Tissington. I'm a researcher based at PARI, and I work on the Compact project, which is a partnership between PARI and SALGA, South African Local Government Association, and Integrity Action. Yeah, so we work around issues like participation, accountability, focused on local government.
And I understand you work across a variety of municipalities. Are those across the country, local, district?
Yeah, so they're all category B municipalities, so they're not metros. They're sort of like secondary cities, smaller sort of municipalities. And we work across 6 provinces. So in each province, we work with 2 municipalities. So it's a whole range of different kinds of municipalities and areas where we work.
With the work that Compact does, what has some of that work revealed about how municipalities respond when communities hold them accountable?
So accountability is an interesting one because I think it's one of those things that, we talk about municipalities wanting accountability, but the reality is that I think everything's been set up in a way that kind of stops accountability from happening. So communities, while there are these formal processes and structures in place, they've been sidelined over the last decades in terms of how they participate and how they're able to actually hold municipalities accountable. So there's often a lot of pushback from municipalities when communities try to engage, and often we see it sort of escalating into protest because there's been really no kind of proper engagement or communication with communities. So it's at a point where, it's pretty dire in a lot of municipalities. It's broken down completely, the relationship. So the program that I work on is trying to see how different ways of trying to improve that relationship, I guess, and tools for municipalities to use to get people participating and to start to take seriously participation. Because, we have a constitution and law and policy that really emphasizes participatory democracy at the local government level. But in reality, we've seen it really kind of decline over the past couple of decades. And people want to be involved. That's the thing as well. I think people sometimes think, people are just sitting back doing nothing. But from what we found in our research and engagements with the municipalities and with communities, people really do want to be involved. They want information. They want transparency, very importantly. They want honesty as well. We know there's challenges with, lack of implementation of projects and infrastructure. So there's challenges within municipalities, but sometimes, what's needed is just for there to be some kind of honesty and transparency around what the issues are and how communities can get involved. And there's various ways, I think, we're looking at the sort of formal mechanisms, but also new kind of innovative ways to think about how can rebuild those kinds of relationships and try to improve accountability, because it's really like one of the biggest problems in municipalities.
So perhaps speak a little bit to some of those innovative ways, those new ways of fostering engagement between local government and communities.
Yeah, so we've got a couple of different tools that we're working on that we've sort of developed with the municipalities. One of the ones, which is sort of the first one we started to develop and which we've been piloting in 2 municipalities, in Kocha and in Oudtshoorn, is something called citizen-based monitoring, which isn't a new thing really. It's been piloted in South Africa before, but mainly in terms of sort of frontline services like health and education. not so much at the municipal level. So what the citizen-based monitoring approach does is we work with ward committee members. So it sort of trains ward committee members as monitors, and they sort of are able then to go and monitor on an ongoing basis infrastructure projects, service delivery projects around water and sanitation, but it really could be on any kind of project. And then that information around what's happening on the projects gets fed back to communities. If there's any issues, that gets escalated in the municipality. So it sort of brings on board a whole lot of people who normally would not be talking to each other, like your ward committee members, your councillor, your sort of consulting engineer, your contractors, people who normally work in isolation from each other, trying to say, how do we build relationships and how do we think about new process to get people to be more involved in what's going on in the municipality and to sort of try, I think, as well to improve implementation.
So with that in mind, could you share some examples of where Compact has shifted the relationship between communities and local government?
Yeah, I'd say in the citizen-based monitoring, we've definitely, I think, been doing that. Another tool that we've been working on, we call the local government collaboration model. So one of the things that definitely came up a lot in our research and with our engagement with communities and municipalities is that there's really not a lot of collaboration happening. And, in terms of participation, there's a whole sort of spectrum of participation. And, collaboration is sort of seen as being one of the best forms where there is a kind of equal engagement of different parties, pooling, resources, pooling their ideas and skills, and trying to come up with solutions to challenges which, one party can't do on their own. So with this collaboration model, it's sort of a catalytic model to say, how do we get people in the room? And because, local government or a municipality is understood in terms of South African law as being, it's the officials, it's the administration, it's the councillors, the politicians, and then it's importantly also the local community. So there's three components. So trying to get all of those three components together in the same room, talking about issues, and we've piloted that as well into municipalities, and just having, community members, ward committee members, plus the mayor, plus other councillors, plus officials. We in the one municipality, Blue Crane route, we were looking at water issues in one of the towns. So we had people from, the councillors, the mayor, we had the speaker, then we had community members, we had unemployed young people who also came. And it was just a sort of space that was created to try to think about, like, what is the challenge? What do we want to see happen? What are the barriers? And then thinking around, like, how to plan to go forward to do things differently. It's kind of a new approach, but we're hoping that we can start to scale it. And Salga, our partner, is really interested as well in collaborative governance. So it's something that's being pushed much more in municipalities to try to get people talking to each other and working together and sort of breaking down some of the silos that have existed in the past. Yeah.
Related to that, there's this kind of idea of co-production at the local level. Explain a bit about what that is, and in this kind of these examples that you've provided us with, how that might operate.
So with the collaboration model, it's really trying to get into that sort of co-production space where, people are coming together and there's a sense of no one person has the answers or solution to this, but there's a need to work together on it. I mean, co-production in the delivery of like public services is a whole thing as well. And I mean, Tracy Ledger works on that a lot. And it's a great concept because it's something that I think for sustainability, definitely, it's something that is key, but also just to build relationships and start to actually do what we're supposed to do, which is bottom-up planning, bottom-up development, actually taking the issues facing people and taking communities seriously in terms of how we think about service delivery. In the past, it's been a very top-down approach. It's been an approach where sort of decisions are made elsewhere. So that, thinking about co-production is really like, how do we work with communities and community organizations to say, let's think about how to do this differently. Let's think about how to shift the power. And I think the issue around power is so critical, and just Because in a lot of municipalities, or in most municipalities, they're very hierarchical. There's a lot of protocol involved. There's a lot of sort of, your turf wars in many cases. So how to respect that still, because there are reasons that that's in place, but also think about how to open up different ways of working together with people. And yeah, I think the more the merrier in terms of trying out new things, because, we're not saying that what we've developed is, the only way. It's like one way, and we're trying to see how it works. But there's so many other ways, and other organizations are also working on it to think about how to do co-production. And yeah, I think it's exciting. The take-up is sometimes slower than you would like because it requires a different way of working and different sets of relationships. So relationship building, I think, is one of the things that you really can't take for granted. And that's what a lot of the work is about. I mean, with the citizen-based monitoring, yeah, we work with like a tech tool, we work with, there's other issues as well, but probably the one thing that really takes the time is the relationship building and the trust. And having those sort of like face-to-face contact engagements that are structured in a way, but also allow for, free thinking and ideas, and people feel safe to really start to think differently about how to do things.
Sure. Because when you're working at a local level, those relationships are so important because it isn't on this bigger scale. But you did speak earlier a bit about scaling this from the pilot projects and municipalities that you're working on. It's not really scaling, but what do you think some of the lessons are that can be drawn from the work that Compact's been doing and this kind of collaborative approach to national government and institutionalizing these collaborative approaches, ideas of co-production?
Yeah, it's something we're thinking a lot about. I mean, we work with Salga, and they're great as a partner because they have this spread across the country. They have provincial offices, so we work with the provincial offices. But we would love to, I think, work more with, provincial COCTAs and national COCTA, because they really are the sort of custodians of local government. In terms of these issues, like, you can't overstate how important it is to have leadership from the top around pushing for these things. So having political will to say, actually, like, we really want to be serious about instilling a culture of participation in municipalities, because the truth is that most participation in municipalities is now being done purely on compliance basis. That has to be like, so it's a tick box exercise. So trying to change sort of the way in which people think about participation and collaboration and co-production, there needs to be, more kind of engagement around these issues at the national level. So we're trying to engage with, the national and provincial departments, and some are more receptive than others to it. But I think, there's a shift now around, with the review of the white paper, which is happening, and obviously the local government election coming up as well. So it's a really interesting time around local government, because people are thinking and taking stock of like what hasn't worked, where have been the barriers, the challenges, and then thinking about, okay, what do we take forward? And I think a lot of it is thinking like we don't need to be reinventing the wheel. We don't need a whole complete change. What we have in place is actually good. There's just reasons why it hasn't been implemented, or for whatever kinds of, challenges we face in municipalities, this has been something that has been sidelined. So how do we bring it back into focus? As being like, this is what we base local government on. It's around participatory democracy. It's around involving communities and community-based organizations in decision-making. I mean, it's a very powerful thing. And I think if we could start to do it more, and we could get the national provincial government to also be sort of saying, let's push this more, you will see a complete, sea change, I think, in terms of relationships between municipalities and citizens. In terms of what they do as well, training, capacity building, that kind of stuff is very important around these issues. With this kind of thing, like peer learning, sharing of good practice, the way in which people, I think, learn and see how to do things is where they see another municipality doing it. And another important thing which we feel strongly about at Compact is a one-size-fits-all approach isn't useful. Municipalities are very different. There's a very different context. Yes, there's a lot of similarities in terms of the challenges, but you've got to adapt things for the specific municipality. So thinking about how to share lessons, I think, is something which at that level particularly can be done and would make a big difference.
In episode 6, we heard researcher Mahlatsi Rampedi describe how communities in Mpumalanga are reimagining the just transition, not just as a shift from coal to renewables, but as a transformation of the whole system. He spoke about grassroots organizations and women-led cooperatives that are building people's plans for energy, jobs, and livelihoods, turning abstract policy into lived local experiments. For them, justice means more than technology. It means ownership, inclusion, and accountability. In this episode, we return to Mahlatsi to go deeper. He explains how communities are navigating the transition with limited state support, creating their own forms of adaptation, cooperation, and resilience, and what that tells us about justice in practice. So, Mahlatsi, what are coal-affected communities saying about the transition?
I can give two parts to this conversation. On the one hand, there isn't a lot of pushback from the communities about the transition. People really do want the transition to some level. You find that in Pumalanga, it's if you look at it from like a bit of a higher point, it's a very scarred sort of like province. And the mining and the power production has brought in a lot of environmental pollution, for example. It has sort of like displaced a few people here and there. So people are quite happy that, there'll be a bit of an improvement in terms of how the environment is. So the pushback essentially comes back from people who pretty much see their ownership of the coal. I mean, it's Emalahleni, it's our coal, so to say. So there's a lot of people who rely a lot on coal for business, for household functions, and other things. A lot of people are employed within the coal sector themselves as well. And because of like shortcomings in like information flows and processes that are happening around the transition, people don't really see how they will adapt economically, how they will adapt in terms of employment. So the pushback comes from there. If you look at youth, for example, they also see the transition as something good to some level, but because of like policy confusions, they don't really know where they stand and what the future holds for them, at a much larger extent, something that is not just going to be a shift in how we use coal, but as well as, how they determine their futures and how they are going to get employment and how they will improve generally their livelihoods.
And the perception of government's role in the transition?
Yeah, that's been a complication for a bit because they see that the role of the government is a bit thin. I mean, the way the transition is packaged, there's this feeling amongst communities within Pumalanga that it is just still another way of government bringing in empty promises, for example. It is sort of like spoiled by the difficulties of public participation, for example. So, it has to be something quite structured for people to adopt and for people to understand and for people not to only participate, but to want to participate in the dialogue and discourse around the transition. So the government's role has been quite thin.
And linked to that, if government's role is quite thin, what are the kind of consequences that you've seen of when state institutions and when government are thin in mining affected communities, in coal power station communities that are being decommissioned and so on?
It goes back to a bit of a governance vacuum. Like you find situations where you sort of have to be well connected to actually get information. You push and pulled in between conversation between, for example, local government and the DMRE. So when we don't have these institutions on the ground, you find that there's disillusionment. It goes back to people just speculating on what the future is going to be, and there's no clear guidelines. For example, if you look at the DMRE as well.
Sure. And in terms of how communities are navigating this moment, I mean, obviously in your research, you've seen how communities are trying to get through this particular moment of transition and the difficulties of dealing with absent state institutions that are in conflict with each other. How are they navigating this?
So communities are sort of finding ways to adapt. They're trying to see what they can do in the moment as processes unfold. A lot of them have sort of like turned into informal economies, for example. I mean, a lot of this has happened a lot with women who used to work in power stations and coal mines, for example, trying to find other work away from their main sources of income, you know. Some are creating cooperatives, you know, so that they can pool in resources and find common ways to adapt to the situation. Some are leaning on to NGOs, for example. There's a lot of NGOs that are in the province trying to help people navigate the economic difficulties of phasing out coal and around this shift in energy production. So even if there's very little support within the communities, you know, you find that there is that large scale resilience from people as they watch the pipeline, as they see what information, what processes are coming through. But, you know, they're adapting. Some, unfortunately, because of how Mpumalanga is sort of structured in terms of population. You know, there's a lot of people that come from different provinces, a lot of people coming from neighboring countries, for example. We met a lot of Mozambicans that work within the trucking industry, within the food economies. We met a lot of people, both locally and from abroad, trying to start small scale farming, for example. So they are adapting. They trying to find some sort of ownership on things that they're doing just so they can counteract some of the difficulties that come with the transition. The only bad thing that I can say about the state of public participation is that it includes the transition in it. That has to be a completely different conversation for people, you know, because now we're just going to fall into that trap where it is packaged as service delivery issue that people don't really have an influence on. And this has been, something that especially mentioned by the youth that, and this is a completely different project. There's something that is not too much away from service delivery, but it is something that will have a much, much bigger and much significant impact on people's livelihoods. That element needs to be included. It has to be very thorough. It cannot just be left to the faults of like normal public participation processes. It's a bit of a shaky ground to operate on or to begin on when talking about these things. So public participation is quite important.
Justice isn't a product we deliver, it is a relationship we build. Dr. Ledger reminds us that co-production is the foundation of procedural justice. Kate Tissington shows how in municipalities, collaboration can rebuild accountability. And Mahlatsi Rampedi reminds us that where the state is absent, people step in. From community halls to council chambers, these stories reveal what a transition looks like, one built with people, not for them. In our next episode, we turn to politics and ask the hardest question of all: how much change is truly possible in the system we have? I'm Tasneem Essop, and you're listening to Just Access, The Real Transition, a podcast from PARI, the Public Affairs Research Institute. If you want to learn more about PARI and their research, go to www.pari.org. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and keep listening.